How many went this morning to our excursion downtown to break bread with people living on the streets? How many went? Thank you. And thanks for going. I Googled homeless, and I probably should have Googled homelessness, because the first thing that came up is the French president's girlfriend might be homeless if he decides his new girlfriend is the first lady. And then another thing that came up, which was kind of interesting, was that it turns out there's quite a few homeless families in the area of Disney World, which, kind of seems incongruent, especially, doesn't it? I mean, having homeless people in our affluent society and world, period, is incongruous, but that was really striking. So there's two kinds of people in the world, homeless and people with homes. And another thing that came up in my search pretty quickly on, I don't think I had to look specifically for this, was an article about homeless veterans. Maybe not surprising. That's something I knew, was that a lot of people who are living on the streets are veterans. What I found out from this article is in the last couple of years, the number of homeless veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan has tripled in just the last couple of years. And there's about 50,000 veterans now in the United States who either are homeless or would be homeless, except that they're receiving federal assistance. So about 40% of people who are homeless in the United States overall are veterans, whereas this seems high to me, but I came across this statistic a couple places. About 34% of people are veterans. It doesn't seem right to me, but so it didn't seem that much, that's not a huge gap, that if 30, anyway, I got to do more math about that. But it still is a lot of people, right? And of course, mental illness is a big aspect of homelessness. The number I came across was about 25% are seriously mentally ill of people who are homeless in the U.S. Of course, addictions are common among people who are living on the streets. And this maybe isn't surprising that, in general, 3/4 of homeless people in the United States are single men. But there's lots of families and children, too, who are homeless, which isn't to say that they're more important than single homeless men, but sometimes that kind of makes us sit up a little bit because it's different than what we imagine sometimes. About 1 in 100 people in the United States don't have homes, which is already a lot, but if you're an African American, that percentage goes way up, because African Americans, Latino Americans, Native Americans are all represented a lot more than you would think from their percentage of population. They're more homeless than others. In San Diego, there's about 10,000 people who are homeless, and that's the third largest in the country, behind New York and L.A., the third largest homeless population. About half of those are on the streets at any time. About half are in shelters. Internationally, 1 in 60 people are homeless in the world. But what's interesting is it turns out there's two kinds of homeless, because you can have a home, but it's a home that's very unhealthy, either structurally or sanitary. And so about 1 in 10 people in the world live in those kind of homes. They're temporary, they're shacks, they're they could collapse on them, or they're unsanitary, so they're very unhealthy. Causes of homelessness, of course, poverty is a huge cause. Poverty caused especially from unemployment or even low wages. A lot of these families, especially on the streets, are what they call working families. Somebody in the family is working full-time. Another cause is the lack of affordable housing. Some of the people we met this morning downtown, they're waiting for shelter, and most of that even is temporary shelter. Although one couple of people we met were waiting for to get in at St. Vincent's, where they can stay for a year. And I'm not too familiar with them, but I think they, during that year, I think their people really work with them to try to help them to be employable and live on their own. And of course, rising food costs, so many reasons for homelessness and mental illness, and then, closing down mental hospitals, which especially happened, I think, about 30 years ago, and then all of a sudden, where do they go? They're on the streets. Internationally, it's interesting, about 70% of those without homes are women and children. Actually, there's two kinds of people in the world, sheep and goats. There's sheeple, and there's goat people. You have to go on the student retreat, the undergraduate retreat next weekend to find out more about what a sheeple is. I got it in. I love that, sheeple. Sheep or goats? Remember that from Matthew 25? Separate the sheep and the goats, those who served and those who didn't. And speaking of the gospel, Jesus himself was homeless in a lot of ways. I mean, he was born homeless, right? And then lived so much of his public life, anyway, on the road. And then in today's gospel story, he calls those disciples to come and follow him. And I don't know if they realized it at the time, but it meant a lot of living on the road without homes. I've been thinking about how, well, first of all, Jesus had to call them twice, evidently, because we just heard just last week they were called. But that was a different gospel, actually. But he calls them here, and they just follow him. And what strikes me is, first of all, from Jesus' perspective, he doesn't seem to have looked at their resumes. He doesn't seem to have really thought this through. Maybe he has. Follow me. And then they just follow him. And, well, if I were mending a fishnet, I'd probably follow him too. But did they realize, no, he meant follow me, not just I'm going down to In-N-Out for a burger, but, be a part of this project of mine. You're leaving everything behind. They just did it. And a lot of us have been inspired by the Pope recently, too, who, as a disciple, has kind of divested himself, not of a home, but of the fancier home he could have had, and then turns out he sneaks out of the Vatican to encounter the homeless and other poor people at nights, and so I wanted to quote from the Pope's apostolic exhortation. Has anybody been looking at that? The Joy of the Gospel, it's called. And you can order it as a book, or you can find it online. It's just so rich. And he cites Mark 6:37 when, the feeding of the thousands, and the disciples tell Jesus, well, we better send them home because so they can get themselves something to eat. They think they're being so considerate, right? Let them go, Jesus. Stop talking. And Jesus says to them, give them something to eat yourselves. Even though they have almost nothing. And yet they pull it out, and there's enough for everyone. And the Pope Francis explains this verse. He says, it means working to eliminate structural causes of poverty as well as small daily acts of solidarity. So what's better, changing the way the society operates through laws and other structures, or feeding the hungry person in front of me? And the Pope says, well, we're called to do both. And he invokes that great, rich word, solidarity. And so in going out this morning to be with people without homes and break bread with them, perhaps we've experienced a bit of solidarity with them. Really, there's one kind of person in the world, and that is the person that reflects Christ. That's everybody, isn't it? Everybody. Jesus says in that gospel about the sheep and the goats, when you served that person, when you fed that person, when you clothed that person, we also encountered some people out there today who brought clothes. They brought socks, you know. He said a lot of times people don't think of socks. And this evidently wasn't a religious group. As far as we could tell, there's a group called Just Saying. And once a month they go out there and bring food and clothes. And when you visited someone in prison, all of those times, Jesus says, you came to me, you served me, you encountered me. Paul says in today's letter to the Corinthians, he says, we're all one. There's no division. There's not your Paul's group, your Cephas's group. It's not Catholics or Episcopalians or this apparently non-religious group out there feeding today, and people who live on the streets and people who don't and people who go back and forth. You're all one. The first person that Annie and I encountered today when we started walking along the streets with our sandwiches to share was this man who could see that we had something to share, some food, and he approached us, but he first just talked with us. He did the approaching. We talked earlier today, before we left, we were talking about conversation starters. How do you start a conversation with a homeless person? And finally, Father John Paul says, well, hello's a good start. And it turned out that worked pretty well. But this time, this man, Fred, was the one who said hello first. And we talked for a while, shared sandwiches, and he talked about blind faith. And he talked a little bit about, he wasn't complaining, but he talked about how in the midst of some challenges he'd had in his life, he was still able to have faith. And he also wasn't bragging. It was amazing how he was talked about this. He was still able to have faith. He talked about blind faith. He said, what do you think about blind faith? And so in this man, Fred, I encountered Jesus. He brought, he served me. He preached to me. He proclaimed God's goodness, God's word to me, and reminded me that, as today's first reading says, and today's gospel too, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. And so those of us who met some new people downtown this morning, we saw lights, new lights, that great light of Christ. And we look around today and we see a great light, the eyes of those next to us, the light that shines as we all gather in together.